William. It's good to be back with you again, talking about airplanes and your philosophy on aviation in general. I know you've got a lot of experience with this. You've been in aviation for many, many years, 30 years if I count it right. And you've been at Embry-Riddle and you were trained at Embry-Riddle. So what is your personal philosophy about risk management? What does risk management mean to you and to Corvairs?
Well, I was trained in all the classic elements of risk management at Riddle and sort of been an aviation professional for an awful lot of years. So I know the same stuff that everybody else knows, but what makes a difference is what did 30 flying seasons teach you about it? If you were out in the field, what serves regular guys who are out there flying? And what is not being discussed beyond the magazine articles that we all read and the textbook stuff. Uh, and the thing that I was slow to learn uh, was everybody starts off with a flight instructor. So you have somebody in your life who is you're looking to for their evaluation of, are you running a good risk management program? How's your awareness? And we start off with this relationship where one guy uh, or woman is your mentor, and you defer to their judgment based on their experience. And by and large, your classic flight instructor is somebody who's got the personal strength to speak to you plainly and tell you the truth. And after you get your pilot's license going, unfortunately, what the great majority of pilots do, just as human nature is, they surround themselves with people who give them nothing but positive feedback and give them a false sense of pat on the back and security. Now, we all need encouragement for sure, but encouragement in flying is different than critical evaluation of what kind of program you're running. And there's this inevitable transition unless people put a positive effort into it. The inevitable transition is they go from having a person whose judgment they defer to and someone they'll listen to without taking it as some sort of personal affront. It's an actual evaluation, and they crave that evaluation to get an accurate yardstick on themselves. And that gets replaced by having your hangar flying buddies and in some cases even the person doing your biennial who is not of the same character that your flight instructor was, where the guy's just getting paid to tell you you're great. And that's the missing element that people don't understand. That that transition where most pilots don't have a single person who they'll take criticism from in a positive way, where they'll actually sit down and say, well, I really hadn't thought about it that way, or uh, that's not welcome news, but I better deal with it. Uh, the way that you used to take your evaluation from your flight instructor. And that just doesn't exist in most people's world. There's this idea of you're going to self-evaluate yourself. Pilots are notoriously poor at this. And there's always this talk and always a lot of magazine articles about self-evaluation. It simply does not work that way. So what you got to do is you got to make the conscious decision that this flying season, you're going to make an effort to identify one person who has a skill set that's superior to yours, but has the strength of character to tell you exactly what a fair evaluation is. And and you got to make darn sure that you're ready to hear it, and that you have the maturity and the strength of character to hear somebody's evaluation. And over time, after you've been doing this for 20 or 30 seasons, you have to be prepared to be that person for somebody else. You have to be that one voice who will explain to somebody, I don't think your program is operating at its full potential. I don't think your decision making's that sharp. Instead of saying it'll be all right and all the other messages, or you should self-evaluate on this, got to come to a position where uh, you can you are seeking out somebody who will speak to you plainly, and what they say you will listen to.
So, what does that mean for building a Corvair engine? I know that's like a huge piece of what you do. Let's apply it to that. What does that mean?
Well, in Corvair's, that's a general philosophy that we have. I'm not somebody's engine salesman. I'm their engine instructor. And beyond engine instruction, I know a lot about risk management and evaluation of things, and we bring that to every day. So that's woven into the program, and I have. That's just sort of integral to what we do. And everybody's going to say, do you run a safe program or anything like that? But they'll default back to salesmen. And the reason why they default back to salesmen is sad but true. And I think everybody who stops and thinks about it will understand this. Sad but true. In America, we've become a culture of people who are averse to hearing criticism. And every salesman knows that you don't ever say anything that's going to upset people. And people have gotten more and more sensitive to this. And that's one of those things that's just part of life. But you have to shed it when you get inside the airport environment and when you get around airplanes. You have to be able to say, I am now willing to hear what qualified people will tell me. And not just people I like, not people I'm comfortable with, people who are actually sharing an important piece of data that I may not be getting right now. And that is not the national mindset. And just because it's not the national mindset isn't an excuse. You have to say, that's the general trend in society, is that people don't like criticism and everybody takes a personal effrontery to it. But you have to say, that's not part of what I do in aviation. You have to make a personal decision that it's not going to be part of what you do. In my everyday work, I have long said that I'm not in this to tell people what they want to hear. I'm in it to tell people what they need to know. And that doesn't always make you the most popular guy. I've got, in many, many seasons of doing this professionally, I've encountered plenty of people when you simply say to them something constructive like, you should check the empty weight on that airplane. I'm reasonably sure you're way over gross on this. This is either met with, thank you, I had not thought of that. I will do so before flying a passenger in this airplane. Or it's met with, oh, I fly over gross all the time. That's not important. Some guy told me that. And it's just two different attitudes. And it's surprising that if you look at it, people didn't behave that way 30 years ago. That wasn't the environment 30 years ago. Just because it's the environment today, you don't have to participate in it. You're running your own individual program. And if it's your own program, you set the standards. Whatever the national mood is, or whatever somebody says the national initiative in aviation safety is, that's a nice idea, but you're personally responsible. And that's the reward of this, is that you can run as tight a ship as you want.
So, what kind of problems have you seen? What kind of mistakes have people made in risk management that you would like to call out, or you think people need to be aware of?
Part of the thing that people have, there are lots of lessons to risk management. The number one lesson in risk management is people think that experience counts. And experience is a factor, but experience doesn't trump judgment. Statistically speaking, you can look at the 2011 accident statistics that came out, which were the first solid ones that were shocking to people who knew what they were looking at. And in the 2011 accident statistics, they showed that flying LSA airplanes, that quite frequently your 200-hour specifically trained LSA pilot was at a lower risk than someone who is a 2 or 3,000 hour general aviation pilot who just hopped into an LSA with no specific transition training. Those people had a lot of accidents, and it was startling to people who got the final confirmation that somebody having 5,000 hours of time is not 5,000 hours worth of experience. And specifically, some people who get to several thousand hours have learned what they can get away with, and that's all that they have to share with people. So even if you're a low-time pilot, you have to regard yourself as a thoroughbred. You have to regard yourself that you can run a safer program than somebody. You don't have to wait till you have 5,000 hours. Your risk management program starts right away when you're getting around airplanes. And quite frankly, a lot of people say, well, I'm going to defer to that guy because he's been flying for 20 years. He may have been a very poor pilot for 20 years. That is not a fair evaluation. Now, that's not always true, but it's frequently enough to show up in the accident statistics. So if you're new to this stuff, you don't have any bad habits to unlearn. Start right now and run a tight program.
Anything else you would like to add on risk management?
Sure, there's a lot to it. It's an ongoing attitude more than anything else. There's always going to be people who are part of the crowd that says, that doesn't matter, or it'll be all right, or I had a guy pencil whip that inspection, or I've got a guy who will give me a biennial and I don't even have to fly in the airplane. And everybody, doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. You have to decide for yourself, will you give in to that sort of attitude about what are you going to get away with? Or are you going to set your own personal standards higher than that? Are you going to decide that for yourself and for the safety of your passengers, that you'll do what it takes to run a much sharper program than that? And the immediate thing that most people need to do to have an immediate increase is seek out one person who will tell you the truth about what you're doing, what your strengths are, but more importantly, what you're not good at. And if that person gives you a fair evaluation, if that person tells you something, decide that you'll be receptive to it. Instead of arguing it, recognize that it's society's nature is training you. Society's nature is training you to say, well, screw that. That person doesn't know what they're talking about. That's great. That won't protect you. That's not risk management. Risk management is listening to qualified critiques from people and thinking about how you're going to tighten up your own program. And that's the missing element. Go back to finding somebody who you have a relationship with, who has the strength of character as your flight instructor did, and go back to being as receptive to evaluation as you were when you were a student pilot. And then keep that attitude from here forward.
When you think back on your life, when was the time when risk management became personal to you? What was the thing, time, event that it really started to mean something to you?
I was still a student at Embry-Riddle when the first person I knew personally was killed in an airplane, and the guy who just graduated, who we went out and spent the evening with, died that night flying to a different location. But that was still sort of textbook in the sense that I knew him, and then he was gone, and there was some lesson to be learned, but it was kind of remote. But I can tell you exactly the day that I saw my first airplane accident in person and saw how people, more important than the accident, was how people behaved and what they could have done and what they didn't do and the ramifications of this. And one of the first jobs I had in aviation was at the Spruce Creek Fly-In Airport. I worked for a great guy named Jim Robb, and we worked out of his hangar. And I was a big part of the EAA chapter then, 288, and we had a lot of very active builders. And amongst them, we had a guy named Joe, who was one of the senior members, who had a Sonoride 2 set up as a single-seater, and he had not flown it in a number of years. And one day, out of the blue, for reasons that I can't really remember, he decided that today was the day that he was going to go out and fly it. And he took it out and taxied out by the tree there at Spruce Creek, but he was reluctant to take it out on the runway for good reason. Seriously, the plane had been stagnant for a long time. He had not flown in as long as anybody could remember, and he was just thinking about taking this out. And there were, I'm going to say, 8 people who stood there and said, you just got to get back on the horse. You just got to get on there and you got to go flying. And you got to take that airplane out. And here I am. I'm, barely past being a student. I'm new to this. This isn't my residential community. I just work here. But I'm there with Jim Robb, and we're standing there, and we are just on the outskirts of this conversation. And Jim was a physically big guy, and he was a member of the community, and he was someone that people would listen to. He had a significant amount of experience. And we stood just on the outside of that conversation when those guys were giving him a hard time and goading him, really. A lot of peer pressure. And we're not talking about teenagers here. Joe was in his late 70s, and the people who were giving him a hard time were 60s and 70s. And he actually, in retrospect, I could see that Jim was tempted to go over and say, hey, all of you drop dead. He was a forceful guy, and he was not shy about doing things like that, but he just didn't do it that day. And Joe went out on the runway, and it was clear that he was not in control of the airplane from the moment he rotated. Somebody called 911 just watching him take off because they knew that the landing was going to be an accident. And he did 4 approaches to the runway that were agonizing to watch. And when he did crash, he was not killed. Airplane was what you would call severely damaged, but he hit his face on the instrument panel, and he bled profusely. And where he ended up happened out of dumb luck to be where Jim was, and got him out of the airplane. He lived. It was very difficult to watch, but I went back to Jim's hangar with Jim. We went back to his hangar, and he's a big tough guy, kind of a John Wayne kind of guy. And we went back to his hangar, and I was thinking, good God, this is terrible. And Jim's actually got blood all over his shirt, and it's a mess. And we're sitting there, and I watched this, and here's what I learned was Jim sat down in the chair and had some sort of overwhelmed. He was overwhelmed by this, and what he was doing was he was reduced to tears by the idea that he had not stepped forward and spoken up for Joe, and he had let those people goad him into it. And I watched this, and this was even uglier than the accident. Now, the piece of background was that Jim's younger brother was a nationally known aerobatic pilot, who was a guy who, Jim was the senior pilot in the family. His younger brother was the more skilled pilot, and his younger brother pushed limits, and this was David Rahm. And I think Jim had 25 years after his brother's death to think, if he was ever given another chance, if fate ever served him another chance, He would not fail to do something. He would not fail to do something to prevent somebody else from having an accident. I don't think you need to have a PhD in psychology to make this connection. I'm watching it face to face. And Jim was crushed by the idea that he had let whatever peer pressure you couldn't remember stop him from taking those 6 steps forward and say, hey, all of you, shut the hell up. Joe, take your airplane back to your hangar. You're not going flying today. And that's all it would have taken, was one person stepping forward and saying, this isn't going to happen. But he didn't. And I got to see the aftermath of that. And got to see the aftermath of Jim, a guy who had promised himself that he would always be that guy. And it happened, and he hadn't done anything. And so I thought at that moment, wow, this stuff isn't from textbooks. This is for real. This is for real. And I thought to myself, better to be thought some kind of jackass than to sit in the chair where Jim's sitting right now and think, God damn it, I wish I said something.
How does that story affect you as a pilot, as a person working in aviation today? What has that done for you, to you, with you?
That was the first accident in person, but in all the seasons since then, I've lost a large collection of friends, and a lot of them were taken out by stuff that was entirely preventable, that they were better pilots than they were on that day. They ran better safety programs than they did on that day. That day was the aberration to how they normally behaved. And somebody should have just said to them on that day, hey, you know not to do this. But nobody did that day. They didn't have anybody. So I thought to myself, I would be the person who just, if I was confronted with this scenario, I would say to somebody, don't do that. That won't end well. And in all the years since, I haven't ever regretted speaking up about it. A lot of people don't want to hear it. As we said before, people don't like criticism. They really don't like it anymore. But I will tell you that the interval between me saying to somebody, do not do this, and them wrecking an airplane with a passenger in it, the shortest interval is down to about 55 minutes. And the shortest interval between me saying to somebody, what you're doing won't end well, and that specific person getting killed, has been shortened down to about 36 hours. So if somebody of experience says to you, time to reevaluate what you're doing, take them seriously. In most cases, people won't, but you can't be the person who doesn't take that type of criticism. And if you know better and you've been around for a number of seasons, learn the lesson that it's unfortunate that those people had accidents even after I said to them, please don't do this. But I'm still glad that I said it to them.
Thanks for sharing that story. I know it means a lot to you, and it's I always learn something talking to you about these things.
Thanks, Phil.
So, William, for somebody who's getting into aviation or is in aviation now, what's a useful learning mindset? What does learning mean?
I think everything in aviation, people talk about learning and all this stuff, but the unfortunate thing about it, when I first got into aviation publishing, the standard story that people wrote was 3,000 or 4,000 words. And I can actually recall the point where they came out and said no magazine story should be longer than 1,000 words on a subject. And I don't think there's really anything worth knowing in aviation that can be explained in 1,000 words in a depth that you would call mastery or even any useful level. But that was the word, and they said everybody's attention span is shorter and people won't read further than that. And I thought, they got to be kidding me. This is not Entertainment Tonight, this is aviation. And I was just, maybe a decade out of Embry-Riddle, where we were fed textbook after textbook, which I still have and treasure and are highlighted because learning was my whole goal. That was the mentality. But over the years, what people consider acceptable levels of understanding in general have dropped. And it's important for people to understand that in our industry, where you would think that people would have held the line on this, they have not. So you have to personally decide that your level of learning that's acceptable is mastery. It isn't being acquainted with it. It isn't learning the tricks of the trade. It's mastery. Does this mean that you have to know every single thing there is to know in aviation? No, we meet people like that all the time, and some guy wants to tell you how the skill set that YB-35 flight engineers had, and he knows this, and that's not really particularly useful. What I'm talking about when I talk about useful is your ambitions might be to fly a Super Cub or a particular experimental that you're building. And your goal should be to learn everything you need to know to have mastery of that aircraft under the situation that you will be flying in. And that means that if you're a VFR pilot, you want not to dabble in IFR stuff, but be weak on stick and rudder skills. It means that you want to have really good stick and rudder skills for the days that you will be flying that particular airplane and know it really well. It's appalling to me, particularly from a risk management standpoint, that you'll come up and meet pilots, and a guy might have 100 hours in his home built, and yet he cannot tell you the VX or VY speeds of the airplane. We once just did an evaluation of a real popular home built, very, very popular LSA home built, and went out and we picked 20 pilots at random who had more than 100 hours in that design that they built, and asked them, what is the maneuvering speed of your airplane? And 19 of them did not know the maneuvering speed of an airplane that they had flown more than 100 hours. The maneuvering speed for that particular airplane was 105 miles an hour, and it was printed on the front page of the plans. And anybody who had a biennial would have to answer that question, and anybody who had actually felt like leaving the ground would know that number. That's the critical number to know of any aircraft. But almost no one knew this. But yet, if you had asked them previously, are you a safe pilot? They would have said yes. And the answer is, any pilot who does not know the maneuvering speed of an airplane that he is flying is not safe, period. I will say that with absolute certainty. And anybody who debates that, they're not safe either. But the people succumb to just learning the tricks of the trade or the things you need to know, and not actually critically pursuing knowing their power plant, their systems, the weather they'll be flying in, because they liked the idea of being a pilot, but they didn't like the practice of it. They liked the idea of being an aviator and being able to tell people that, but the actual practice of being an aviator, the part that's self-rewarding, is the learning and the knowledge of it. And these people had just decided that they were going to abdicate from that because it was a little too tiring or required a little too much work. That's also where all the reward happened to be. They decided they were going to eliminate the reward, not just the work. So the level of learning has to be mastery of the aircraft you will be flying on the days you will be flying it for the situations that you'll be in. And that's where the reward is. There's very, very little reward, if any, no real reward anyway, to seeing what you can get away with or how little you can understand. I personally would find it mortifying if somebody could come up to me and ask me a simple question about an airplane that was in the pilot's operating handbook and I had no idea what it was. I also, you'd think there are people who are doing that not for single-seat airplanes, but they're doing it and they had passengers in the airplane too. That's a ethically completely indefensible position to be in. And you'd think that people would, if they found out they had been operating like that, they would have a serious personal reflection moment and change the way they do things. Unfortunately, that's not true. But if you find yourself in that position, what your personal program in aviation is determined at that moment that you find out that there's something that you don't know, is your attitude to say, I will learn this, or I don't know if you need to know it. And there, right there, is the answer to what you will get out of aviation. Will it be a waste of your time and accepting unnecessary risk? Or will it be something that you really did right in your life? Really, really right.
Do you have any personal stories or any personal examples about these blockers to learning?
The biggest one is much more prominent today than it was 30 years ago. There people decide who they're going to learn stuff from. And in my own personal opinion, I decided a long time ago that I would learn everything I needed to know. I didn't care if I had to learn it from Satan himself. You get a lot of people who have single-seat airplanes and they decide they're going to run a loose safety program and they're going to take risks. I actually believe in personal freedom enough to say that if somebody wants to go out and run risks like that in their own life and they're not flying over somebody else's school, great, have at it. I actually believe that. But when somebody's got a passenger seat in their airplane and the people who are going to sit in that passenger seat are obviously going to believe, whether it's true or false, they're going to believe that the pilot did everything at his disposal to keep them safe. And if you go up to the same pilot and say, are you willing to learn with an open mind from anyone who can teach you something that will make the person in your passenger seat safer? If they say, sure, as long as the guy's got a look that I like, or he doesn't charge anything to learn this, or if they got a condition on who they'll learn from, then they didn't do anything it would take to keep that person in the passenger seat safe. They just simply didn't, if they have a condition. So if you want to run a better program, decide right now that you will learn anything you need to know from whoever knows it, and you'll discard your personal prejudices or personal qualifications on who you learn from. And go back to that saying, which is, if it keeps my passengers safer, I'd learn it from Satan himself.
Anything else you want to add on learning in aviation?
All of this stuff, all of it boils down to not what the industry trend is, not what everybody in your EAA chapter is doing, not what people online are talking about. It all boils down to when you're presented with understanding that your ambitions in aviation, what you held sacred, what you wanted to do, it boils down to the moment you look at it and say, I'm not being true to what my personal goals were in aviation, the things I wanted to do, the kind of aviator I wanted to be. What is your immediate response? Is your immediate response to kind of let it go and blow it off and go back to the comfort zone of the people who reassured you that, hey, it'll be all right? Or do you sit down and say, I will not let another season pass in aviation without me becoming better. I will not. I do not care what other people are doing. I am not in charge of their life. I am in charge of my own life. And what I get out of this will be determined by how much willpower I bring to bear on this. It's a personal decision. All of it's a personal decision. Aviation is a personal experience. It's not a national trend.
Thanks, William.
Thanks, Phil.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like what you're seeing, please remember to subscribe.